Hello everyone, here is Tatiana Bazzichelli, the director of the Disruption Network Club, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you to our 34th conference, Investigating the Kill Cloud, that is also marking the 10 years of the Disruption Network Club. So first of all, I feel to thank a lot my team that managed to reach this point with me, and also all the team that has been with us in the past 10 years. We are connecting from the Kunstquartier Bethanien in Berlin, but we are also online. So I want to welcome the audience that is online and also the audience that is here. And very happy to see that despite the early time of today, also we have a full room. So thank you for being with us. And a really special thanks goes to Jutta Weber, that is the professor for media culture and society at Paderborn University, that is shaping the day with me. And today we will see her on stage moderating a really great panel. So thanks, Jutta, for the great cooperation. And I'm very happy to welcome you at the Disruption Network Club. But before going into the depth of today, I would like to mention what we did yesterday. Yesterday was also a very long day and very important for us, since we did an analysis of the kill clouds. That is this concept that we have been working on now since many years. And we brought together the links between AI and warfare, companies, and the military. We also spoke about the importance of whistleblowing in the field of networked warfare. And we finally had the very big moments of the presentations of our research of the Disruption Network Institutes. We have been working together for 15 months on the project investigating the kill cloud, information warfare, autonomous weapon, and AI. And you can find the papers of the fellows online. And I'm very happy that we spent together this time with Joanna Moll, Lisa Ling, Jack Paulson, and Naomi Colvin. So really a deep thanks to them again. And the papers are online, also at the website of the Disruption Institute. Today we will speak about the implication for the human-machine relationship and future forms of warfare. And specifically also about the idea of the responsibility of a human on the loop. And later then we will touch the discourse of the role of art as visualization of evidence. And we conclude the day with a panel about the use of AI and targeted killing in Gaza. So I'm very happy and proud that we have this program today, and I hope all of you will stay until the end. I also want to thank our funders and cooperation partners that you can see on the screen. And at the same time, I want to mention that at the Disruption Network Club, although we are now celebrating our 10 years, like many organizations in Berlin, we are also very much struggling with our funding, since next year is completely unsecured. So I really want to tell everyone to think about us and also support us in these moments. We also started a fundraising campaign, so any help is necessary. It's not only us, I mean, the whole city of Berlin is struggling. Yesterday there was a really big demonstration in front of the Rathaus to save the culture of Berlin. We are also touched by this, especially also for the kind of program that we do. You can imagine we have been trying to be very critical for many years, and now we know also the rise of extremism is becoming a problem. So we really want to tell you that if it's possible, and if you know the way to also support our system, this is the time. But I don't want also to start with this, sad note. But it's always important to mention, because it's also a political struggle that we are doing. But now I want to transition into the day that is waiting for us, and also very happy to go on with the program and to involve then Jutta on stage. Before, I want to say that we have our audience online that is listening, and we have always the possibility to involve them too by using a chat. So it's possible to ask questions to our panelists, and the moderators will call you in, speaking with our team on the left that will read the questions. So feel free also to ask questions if you are not here in Berlin. And finally, I'm very happy to call here Jutta on stage with me. And I want to introduce you properly. So Jutta Weber is a professor for media culture and society at Paderborn University. Her research focuses on computational technoscience cultures, asking how and for whom the non-human actors work. She is currently leading two MBF research networks, meaningful human control, autonomous weapon systems between reflection and regulation, and as well as being tagged the digital reorganization of the world. And she has been a visiting professor, for example, at the University of Uppsala and in Vienna, and she has been working for a very long time on this subject. For example, selected publications go from autonomous drone swarms and the contested imaginary of artificial intelligence to kill list, drone warfare, and the politics of databases. So, Jutta, I'm very happy to do this program together today and welcome you at the Disruption Lab.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for letting me part of that and contributing to this wonderful conference. I really enjoyed the day yesterday with all the input you gave. I'm supposed not to. Yeah, what I said. So welcome to everybody in Bethanien, in Kreuzberg, and also online. I'm happy to be here. And also thanks for you and your team, bringing also the Disruption Network Lab into being. As you said, it's a 10 years anniversary. And when you were saying I'm doing a long time research, I remember I was part of an EU project on robotics and ethics, which started in 2004, when I realized teleoperated drone warfare is going on, and I was really shocked. And then I realized that's 20 years now. So I said story anyhow. What I want to say is, I hope that you can continue with the Disruption Network Lab, because it's a very important place, and we need this time, space, places to investigate and to do this kind of critical research, and it's getting harder and harder to find these spaces, so I very much hope you can continue. What I want to say, and I'm also very thankful for bringing together whistleblowers, researchers, artists, and so on, because I think this is also very productive. I recently found a quote, and I want maybe to start with that before I go into details, by now paraphrasing David Lyon. I think some people know him. He's kind of the, I just wanted to say, godfather of surveillance studies. And he more or less said, what might happen if AI were guided by an ontology of peace rather than violence, an ethic of care rather than control, an orientation toward forgiveness, maybe I wouldn't say forgiveness, but openness rather than suspicion. I'm not sure whether this is possible, and I will talk about the immanent materiality and epistemology of technology in a moment, but I've found it worthwhile to think about this question. So, thanks. Because I was arguing I don't want to sit, and they provided that space for me, which I was really thankful for. Okay, so Tatjana already mentioned our competence network. I didn't make that up, but that's how it's called. Is meaningful human control, autonomous weapon systems between reflection and regulation, and it's based at 5 universities, Hamburg, Hanover, Bonn, Ostfalia, and us. Very different disciplines we are working on. And I totally agree with Naomi. Yesterday she said, this concept of meaningful human control is totally fuzzy. That's true. But I think at the time, I think it was Article 36 and as well as Noel Sharkey who more or less invented this term. And I think they just wanted to clarify that what is called control in the context of autonomous weapon system is not worthwhile, this concept. And that's why they tried to press, we need meaningful human control, whatever that means. Just saying that was, I think, the background. Okay, so, and this is a great opportunity. Tatjana already mentioned, this panel is a kind of a follow-up of our conference, Imaginations of Autonomy on Humans, AI-based Weapon Systems, and Responsibility at Machine Speed. We did this year in May at Paderborn University, which more or less was very close to the topic today. I'm not going into the content of that. Our project in Paderborn is situated in the field of science and technology studies. And I think this is important because if I now follow the discourse on not only weapon systems, but also AI-based decision-making systems, targeting systems, I have now the feeling there's a specific tension between those who argue that maybe it's the AI which kind of leads to indiscriminate killing, for example, and then the others are, but it's also important to look at how these systems are used, and I think both is true. And I think the most important thing and the challenge, at least that's my background in science and technology study, is to think about human-machine assemblages and the effects of how they work together, or what the materiality that comes with it, the epistemological underpinnings, and so on. So neither to focus only on the humans and the machines to understand what's going on there, but that as the assemblages, they are exhibit agency. But the tricky thing is, I think the responsibility only stays with the humans. So you have this interaction between humans and machines, which produces specific effects, but the responsibility can't be inbuilt, I think, in the machines, because now we have these strange discussions on responsible AI in the military domain. I've been to a conference, I think I was never to a conference as luxury as that one, in The Hague last year, and I was really surprised how much this idea turns into, maybe it's a business model, but that's a different discussion, but talking about responsible AI in the military domain is really, from my perspective, quite ridiculous. So, also human in the loop and similar concepts are not helpful, I think, because they build exactly on this separation of humans and machines, and that there might be the possibility of a full rational control of these very complex systems. Beyond context, beyond knowledge asymmetries, beyond experiences inscribed into bodies, we learned about that yesterday, the materiality of machines, emergent effects, and so on. So the autonomy of decision, targeting, killing systems is a discursive imagination, so it has real effects, and the promises of speed, precision, and the view from nowhere is promoted by politicians and the military and technicians, and I think they drive a hegemonic global neo-colonial discourse and devalue investments in diplomacy, conflict management, and peace research. And I really wonder recently, and that's why I brought in this question of ontology of peace. I don't know internationally, but at least in Germany now, it feels like peace is turning into a strange concept. So it sounds like being old-fashioned. I mean, it's great to talk about technology, about warfare, AI, and peace always sounds like so old-fashioned. And I think it would be worthwhile how we could reintroduce a discourse on peace again, because I think we desperately need this. Anyhow, we need to develop a new understanding and new approaches of military human-machine configurations. I'm convinced that we need to analyze the epistemological and ontological foundations of these systems, or of these more or less carefully constructed machines of violence, I would say. We need to understand the algorithmic assumptions, the materiality of the systems, but also the sociotechnical imaginations and perspectives that come with them. So not to excuse the humans who use the machines as an excuse for the wrongdoing, but also to understand the effects of a long history and inscribed practices of human-machine interaction now. I found this also interesting in the computer science and military discourse. They're now talking about human-machine teaming. So, to give you a concrete example, and now I look for the minutes, but I have no idea. I just wanted to mention, I wrote, I think it was 2016, a paper on the disposition matrix, a kill list done by the US military, or no, the Obama administration, I need to say. And when I read the paper by Jewel Abraham last November, I think it was, it felt like a déjà vu, actually, because I thought what's going on there is very close to what I try to understand how the disposition matrix is functioning. I think it's another example for the production of a kill list via sloppy military data science with the help of big data platforms such as Google, Amazon, or Palantir. So the disposition matrix was designed to filter out terrorist characteristics and behavior patterns via data mining, and therefore the US military, and this is really interesting, I believe the US military and security services then worked with the so-called terrorist screening database, beneath other things, it's not the only one. And as there's no clear definition of terrorism, not even in the US, I think they use different ones, and internationally there's no definition, it's unclear who's considered. So I can't go into that in a minute. 10 years ago, this terrorist screening database included several hundred thousands of people, including several thousand Americans. Today it's 2 million people. And I think this tells you something about the materiality or the inner logic of this technology. So tens of thousands of people also have complained to the US government about being on the list. 98% of them were so-called false positives. Their name simply resembled that of another person in the database. So this logic rests on a techno-rationality that works with the logic of a systemized tinkering approach, using trial and error to explore the unknown by sifting through vast amount of data, looking for patterns, and establishing many, often very unlikely correlations between data points in order to discover knowledge in databases. And actually, correlation focuses mainly on probabilities instead of factual relationships as known from causality. I think I'm always, again and again, I'm occupied with this shift in science, and I guess computer science also regards itself as a science from causality to correlation, which is basically more, if two significant events happen at the same time, this might happen again in the future. You're not asking why. So this is more very basic discorrelation paradigm, which I think is highly problematic. And when I read, and I think it's very not similar, but as I said, it was a déjà vu reading on the lavender system. So you have like 37,000 people marked as possible suspects of a population of 2.2 million people in Gaza. All suspects identified as male automatically regarded as relevant targets, and here again the question arises, how are terrorists defined? What are the unique relevant characteristics of these people collected in this database? And what I also find really striking, that the lavender system is known to have an error rate about 10%. 10%. So obviously the IDF considers it acceptable to kill many innocents due to technically caused errors, because I think that's the inner logic of machine learning, which produces this error rate. It's the result of the system's fuzziness, if you ask me. And then I was wondering myself, imagine, would the IDF, the US military, accept weapons which have a probability of 10% of friendly fire? Would you accept that? And I guess no, right? Why do you accept it? To kill probably approximately correct civilians. And probably approximately correct. I love that book. I was mentioned by a colleague, he's a machine learner. That's a very well-known book in computer science on machine learning. And this book is titled, Probably Approximately Correct. Imagine. That's the basis for killing people. Okay. The lavender system, as well as the disposition matrix, use search criteria in their algorithms, which are defined very broadly, not to miss anything and to capture all possible correlations and patterns. Accordingly, the number of false positives increases rapidly. To avoid too many mistakes, you would need a precisely defined terrorist profile, and that's not possible. US security expert Bruce Schneier wrote already in 2006, data mining for terrorist plots will always be fuzzy. The vague definitions lead to a massive increase in the number of suspects, in the number of people being killed, people becoming targets, then being killed. And one of the problems is they often use, for example, quantitative link analysis. I guess some of you are familiar with that. If you contact too often a suspect, you might turn yourself into a suspect. A very simple rule in the end. And that's why the database is exploding in that, so that you had a database where you had a few 100,000 people, and today there are 2 million people. And I think this is part of this underlying epistemological logic which I'm interested in. So, let's see. Give me a little bit. So, the techno-rational underpinning of AI is not surprisingly leading to systems killing innocent civilians on a large scale. At the same time, these systems can also be used by the military, gaming with its parameters to even heighten or lowering the killing rates. But what is most surprising for me is the fact, and not only looking towards the military, that we live in a society and time in which at least large parts of politics, partially the military, accept a 10% error rate of a killing system like the disposition matrix or the lavender. Being afraid of unknown, as yet unimaginable dangers, and are therefore willing to dispense with traditional scientific methods, which at least aim toward exactness and scientific rigor. I'm not saying they are achieving it, but at least that was an inbuilt value in the system. You have now fuzzy automated procedures of recombination and imagination. These procedures of knowledge production no longer focus on problem solving, but work with adaptive reasoning, that is, the attempt to generate new explanatory hypotheses by juggling the unknown unknowns. Within this tinkering logic, everybody can become a target, so it's more likely for some than others. At the same time, the ever-increasing collection of huge amounts of surveillance data is further justified, because the bigger the database is, the more correlation you can discover in your database. So, My analysis of the underlying techno-rationality of the system does not aim at claiming it's only the epistemic logic of the AI-based systems producing deadly effects. How humans are setting the parameters, as I said before, in these machine learning algorithms, or how they set up a so-called collateral score is an important part of the story. I do not think it's productive to ask whether AI is driving the indiscriminate killing or whether it's the humans. For me, the decisive question is how human AI assemblages work, how they reconfigure sociotechnical practices of contemporary warfare, how experience and perception is reconfigured, but also what does it tell about the society we live in, accepting this 10% error rate in highly automatized systems. And this error rate, I mean, it comes on top of the collateral damage. And it reconfigures also the concept of the civilian, but I'm not going into that. So, how can we build, to wrap up or to finalize in the end, how can we build an AI resting on an epistemology and ontology of peace? And how would it look like? Or maybe even that is the wrong question. I don't know, but that's how I want to finalize. Now I want to end here just to give a bit of a background for a panel to follow. And now I want to introduce the panelists. And I ask them to come here. The title of the panel, and now I need again my paper. I'm very happy that Lucy Suchman, Elke Schwarz, Erik Reichborn-Kjennerud, I always do it wrong, and Marijn I managed, but again, Hoijtink accepted the invitation and that they are here today. And I will give a brief introduction of everybody, but they told me don't make it too long because you can read it on the website and we have it here. So very, very briefly, thank you for coming, for being here, for doing this panel together. Lucy Suchman, I think, is one of the most well-known STS researchers. Anyhow, I'm saying this, we were a bit laughing yesterday because somebody said, okay, there's this field, science and technology studies, have you heard about it? And we said, okay. So Lucy was, now she's Professor Emerita of Lancaster University. She has been a professor of anthropology of science and technology. She was also a principal scientist at Palo Alto Research Center, and I always say that, but you really need to check on YouTube or FreeTube. FreeTube is much better. There are still little videos she did with 2 artificial intelligence researchers, what was it, 80s? Trying to make a copy machine work and guessing what this machine might do or might not do. Wonderful. I think there were 2 very influential books, Human Machine Reconfigurations, and now I forgot, Plans and Situated Actions. That's the earlier version, or not version, but the other book. And maybe one thing more, because talking about political context, she was a founding member of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. Many other things to say I'm not going to say. Thanks, Lucy, for coming. And now I wonder whether I need to introduce. No, maybe I'll ask you to give your contribution, and then with every contribution, I introduce all the others. So thanks, Lucy, for coming.
Thank you very much, Jutta. And yes, my clicker. So I want to start by acknowledging the Disruption Network Institute's critical attention to issues of data, surveillance, militarism, and social justice, and my thanks for this and for the past events. My own work wouldn't be possible without on-the-ground reporting by the whistleblowers and investigative journalists who form the core of the network. I'm indebted to Lisa Ling and Sean Westmoreland for their analyses of the through lines of military infrastructures from colonial histories to present implementations, as well as their investigations of the actual injuries inflicted by the operations that they were part of, and to Thomas Drake and all of the other whistleblowers who have come out of the military machine. The starting place for my contribution today is the invocation of precision and accuracy in the justification of data-driven warfighting, and the relation, or more importantly, the difference between precision as a matter of the accuracy with which a weapon, once launched, will reach its target, and the prior and crucial question of the validity of the identification of something or someone as a legitimate target. In military discourse and associated media reporting, the term precision almost always refers to the first sense, the relation between the weapon and its target, while the question of how something was designated as a target is left begging. But that is the overriding question if we're concerned with the lawfulness or criminality of warfighting. There's a parallel between this question and the idea of what's called ground truth in the technical practices of machine learning. Ground truth as a technical term claims to be aligned with truths on the ground in the sense of the lived experiences and relations of persons in places. The sense of the ground as we might refer to it colloquially when we look at an image like this one, which I'll say more about shortly. The motivating context for me in thinking these two problems together is the embrace of data-driven targeting by the US and Israeli militaries, a situation that concerns me both as a Jewish American and from a broader commitment to paths towards disarmament and demilitarization. Data-driven warfighting now sails under the flag of AI, an acronym that my colleague Andrew Clement has helpfully suggested should best be expanded as algorithmic intensification. The figure of AI, I've argued along with many others, is a highly mystifying label for practices dominated in the present moment by machine learning and its elaborations as so-called deep neural networks, computational techniques that extract, as Jutta was saying, statistical correlations, which are designated as patterns, from data sets based on the adjustment of relevant parameters according to either internally or externally generated feedback. That is the reinforcement learning human feedback that's done by data labelers and others. These results are then used as the basis for automated prediction, recommendation, and decision systems. In a paper titled, "We Get the Algorithms of Our Ground Truths," Florian Jayton observes that, quote, "Behind many algorithms lies a ground truth database that has been used to extract relevant numerical features and evaluate the accuracy of the automated transformations of inputs into targets." Interesting to note that is the generic name for the output of a machine learning system. Consequently, as soon as algorithms in the wild outside of their production sites automatically process some new data, their respective ground truths are invoked and, to a certain extent, reproduced. Ground truths and the data sets from which they're built and that they reproduce require, and largely presuppose, operations of datafication. That is, the rendering of worlds of interest as numbers. This becomes a problem, Lisa Gittelman and her co-authors have argued, when those numbers are naturalized through the erasure of the interpretive and translation work through which enumeration, or data reduction as it's called, gets done. This argument was set out very powerfully by Jeffrey Bowker and Lee Starr in their book, Sorting Things Out, classification and its consequences, where they show how systems of classification work to produce and reproduce the objects and relations of affinity and difference that they represent or describe. Difference, they observe, or distinctions among things, is the prime negotiated entity in the construction of a classification system. And difference, of course, works always in relation to likeness. So placing something into a category is an assertion of its similarity, at least sufficiently for practical purposes at hand, to other members of that category. In military discourses and media reports derived from them, data are consistently naturalized, treated as objectively given signals that are just emitted by the world. This glosses over a myriad of questions, including what is actually detectable through technologies of surveillance and what is not, and how machine-readable signals get translated through labeling into what the military names actionable intelligence. The latter is based on assumptions about the validity of categorical modes of identification of objects, of persons, so-called patterns of life, as well as massive reliance, as Jutta also mentioned, on the assignment of guilt by association, which is a problem I'll come back to shortly. The work of making that distinction is conceptualized in military doctrine as the result of a process named the kill chain, that is the procedures through which persons become targets for the use of lethal force. So here's a recent rendering of that showing how the canonical OODA loop, that observe, decide, orient, act, has been updated to place sensor data at the origins of a procedure labeled here as F2T2EA, or find, fix, track, engage, and assess. We should note that engage in this context generally is taken to mean the use of lethal force. That's the killing part. There's much more to be said about this diagram, but the central point I want to underscore is that these processes are increasingly imagined through a frame of datafication, particularly by those interested in automating them using techniques of machine learning. While we're focused here on its recent instantiations, the data-driven targeting imaginary has a longer history dating back at least to US operations in Southeast Asia. Articulated in 1969 by General William Westmoreland, then Chief of Staff of the US Army, who offered these thoughts over lunch, quote, "On the battlefield of the future, enemy forces will be located, tracked, and targeted almost instantaneously through the use of data links, computer-assisted intelligence evaluation, and automated fire control. I see battlefields on which we can destroy anything we locate through instant communications and the almost instantaneous application of highly lethal firepower. With cooperative effort, no more than 10 years should separate us from the automated battlefield." And while US efforts to implement this fantasy on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam, named Operation Igloo White, was an infamous failure, the holy grail of data-driven omniscience and weapon systems automation lives on. Some 5 decades after General Westmoreland's vision, the US Department of Defense has built out its infrastructures of surveillance beyond its capacity to render the data generated as usable information. In April of 2017, the DoD announced plans for its flagship AI project, the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, codenamed Project Maven, and accompanied by this rather astonishing logo. The announcement of Project Maven by then Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work asserted the urgent need to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning across DoD operations. Project Maven's aim, more specifically, Work states in his memorandum, is, quote, "to turn the enormous volume of data available to the DoD in the form of full motion video into actionable intelligence and insights at speed." End of quote. The plan, as Work sets it out, includes an initial project focused on the task of labeling data within full motion video images generated by US drone surveillance operations, as a first step toward establishing the algorithms and the computational infrastructures needed to automate object detection, classification, and alerts in support of military operations. The media reports surrounding Project Maven overwhelmingly beg the question of the criteria by which objects are identified as imminent threats. We're told that 38 categories were used by those who hand-labeled the first 150,000 images to form the initial training data, including the object, an ISIS pickup truck. This is in the context of US drone wars and the so-called war on terror. And so what we see here is a pilot's display in a ground control station showing a truck from the view of a camera on an MQ-9 Reaper during a training mission at Creech Air Force Base in Indian Springs, Nevada. The Reaper is a, quote, hunter-killer unmanned aerial vehicle and is designed to engage what the military calls time-sensitive targets on the battlefield. Project Maven raises the question of the correspondence between systems for the categorization of images of objects, in this case a truck, and how objects are incorporated into complex and changing relations and associated practices, which brings us back to the problem with which I began. As Grégoire Chamayot observed a decade ago in his book, A Theory of the Drone, the claims for precision that justify new investments in automated targeting systems are based on this systematic conflation of the relation between a weapon and its designated target on the one hand, and the identification of what constitutes a legitimate target on the other. No amount of improvement in the precision of targeting in the first sense can address the ongoing uncertainties of target identification. This conflation is part of a campaign to deny the increasing reliance of these systems on ever more questionable forms of stereotypic categorization of what and who constitutes a legitimate threat, and the expanding temporal and spatial boundaries of what comprises an imminent threat. Nonetheless, the leading justification for these systems has always been the promise of precision and accuracy in targeting in the name of adherence to international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. In a public plenary in February of 2021, Robert Work, who you'll remember from that Project Maven memo, who was then co-chair with Eric Schmidt of the National Security Commission on AI, offers this demonstration of moral reasoning. He says, "The biggest contributor to inadvertent engagement is target misidentification. Humans make mistakes all the time in battle. And the hypothesis to be proven that the hypothesis is that artificial intelligence will improve target identification, which should improve and reduce the number of collateral damages, reduce the number of fratricides. So it is a moral imperative to at least pursue this hypothesis." This hypothesis enacts a familiar move, as failures of humans becomes the justification for further automation. Combining magical thinking with a leap of faith, which is named here a hypothesis, the proposition is that automated systems will somehow transcend the limits of the very knowledge practices that must necessarily inform them. But we now have ample evidence that the automation of data analytics works to reproduce and amplify the classificatory schemas that inform the data set. And nowhere is this more treacherous than when the data set is made out of proxy signals, profiles, and so-called patterns of life. While Project Maven ran into some early roadblocks, it is alive and well and now a DoD program of record. In 2022, the Pentagon handed the Maven program to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, responsible for processing the US's vast intake of aerial surveillance. In an interview with the defense media outlet Breaking Defense, Vice Admiral Robert Sharp, outgoing NGA director, said the fusion of Project Maven with his agency's ongoing efforts will, quote, "give us our millions of eyes to see the unseen." The primary developer of the newly named Maven Smart Systems is Palantir, led by self-satisfied master of war, Alex Karp, earlier this year securing a $480 million contract with the US Army. Command and control in the moment of generative AI is built on top of Palantir's AI platform, offering access to a large language model-based backend through a dashboard that includes a ChatGPT-style conversational interface. Palantir assures its military customers that the platform has been designed to activate data and models, quote, from classified systems to devices on the tactical edge to maintain a real-time representation of the battle space. The truths on the ground of data-driven warfighting have become abundantly clear with the reported application of machine learning to targeting by the IDF. We're going to go into this much more deeply in the final panel of the day. So I'll just point to the series of investigative reports published in the Palestinian-Israeli outlets Plus 972 and Local Call, published in November of last year. But this brings us to this image from my opening slide. This is a photo introduced by the Israeli Defense Team at the International Court of Justice in The Hague in response to the charge of genocide brought to the court by South Africa. We see here an aerial view of a street in Gaza, annotated in white to show the boundaries of a building labeled hospital and a human figure identified as a terrorist, carrying an object labeled as a rocket-propelled grenade or RPG launcher. The white line indicates that the figure is inside the boundaries of the hospital grounds. The annotations in red have been added by the London-based group Forensic Architecture. Forensic Architecture has conducted an extensive investigation of 10 exhibits introduced as evidence by the Israeli Defense Team at the ICJ, providing systematic counter-evidence for misrepresentation in each. In this case, the claim of Hamas's use of human shields by basing their operations in civilian infrastructure. Forensic Architecture's analysis of this exhibit showed that the building labeled hospital is in fact a residential building outside the grounds of the hospital complex that was subsequently bombed. We could, of course, also question the designation terrorist here, part of the wider erasure of any reciprocity regarding who has a right to self-defense, as well as the question of proportionality in Israel's massive and ongoing attacks on residential buildings, hospitals, and schools in Gaza, all of which are now also refugee camps, and so further prohibited as targets under the laws of war. Most notably, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza has shifted the argument for AI-enabled targeting from claims to greater precision and accuracy to the objective of accelerating the rate of destruction. IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari has confirmed that in the bombing of Gaza, quote, the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. For those who have been advancing precision and accuracy as the high moral ground of data-driven targeting, this admission must surely be disruptive. It shifts the narrative from a technology in aid of adherence to international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions to automation in the name of industrial-scale productivity in target generation, enabling greater speed and efficiency in killing. So I'm going to skip to my last slide, a wonderful quote from Judith Butler and from a German set of German peace activists arguing against the premise that war can be rationalized. But let me close with this. Recognizing the limits of data, of course, runs counter to the military project, but those limits exist nonetheless. In Cloud Ethics, Louisa Moore writes, when machine learning algorithms segment a social scene, generating clusters of data with similar propensities, everything must be attributed. Yet that which is unattributable does remain within the scene, exceeding the algorithm's ability to show and tell, as well as opening onto a different kind of community and a different mode of being together, of being ethico-political. So while we need to pay attention in the current moment to the enormous expansion of signal-generating infrastructures, we also need to attend more closely to that which escapes capture by datafication, from complex social relations to the lived experience, who find themselves at the center of targeted discrimination and the exercise of violent power. The aim is to challenge the ideology of rational and controllable state violence that's foundational to technomilitarism and the building out of the military complex by exposing its senseless and unaccountable injuries. More specifically, our task is to interrupt the narratives that underwrite the current diffusion of data-driven algorithmic systems under the sign of AI, to spotlight the self-interests of those who preach technological determinism and techno-solutionism, and to redirect attention and resources invested in the security of some to projects in deep and creative diplomacy, de-escalation, and demilitarization in the name of social justice and planetary security for all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lucy. It's really great. We have the discussion later. We are immediately going to the next contribution, and I now ask Erik to come forward. I think you wanted to use. And I want to introduce Erik, and I need a piece of my notes. So, Erik is Reichborn-Kjennerud, however. is a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs in Norway. He holds a PhD in war studies from King's College London and an MA in security policy studies from the George Washington University. His research interests include contemporary Western warfare, war and technology, military theory, and operational thinking and practice, critical international relation theories, and science and technology studies again. And I highly, highly, highly recommend his forthcoming book, which is called The World According to Military Targeting, which will be published with MIT Press in 2025. Please, Erik.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you for those kind words. And thank you to Disruption Lab and Tatiana and yourself for inviting me here. And it's very exciting to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the worlds that the military, and particularly the US military, makes up and the specific ways in which they have done so and do so today as well. To me, these worlds are what we can, after Paul Edwards, call closed worlds. There are specific abstracted worlds that contain particular understandings and ways of doing things in that world. What I mean by this is that these understandings are not simply descriptions of a world or a representation of a set of problems, but rather, and also importantly, prescriptions about how to go about the world how they understand that world. They're in a sense operational models, activating specific ways through which the military can imagine, assemble, and wage war. Although I'm primarily interested in a specific way and at times highly abstract techniques and technologies for producing these worlds, of course at stake here is the very violent world that surrounds us and which we've already heard about yesterday and today. We don't have to look very far to see that war, massacre, and devastation have never left us, but continues to haunt humanity in novel ways and with novel technologies and modes of operation. To me, the contemporary and future ramifications of warfare are a grave concern. And in this world, my overarching goal is to question and destabilizing these military worlds. I want to question their epistemological premises, the technological assumption, rationalities, and logics that underwrite the current infrastructures operating under the moniker of so-called AI. Today, we are at the conjuncture in which we can see the long historical trajectory of what Jeremy Packer a decade ago argued in relation to the creation of the so-called semi-automatic ground environment, or SAGE, which was an anti-nuclear defense system developed in the 1950s, as the automation of perceptual, memory, and epistemological labor. Today, this automation is only accelerating, bringing extreme speeds, extreme range, and extreme lethality to war and our worlds. Of particular concern to me is so-called digital twin Earths. Today I will offer a diagnostic screening of the present to tell a story of how we ended up in this world. To do so, I use history as a critical engagement with the present condition. The goal here is not simply to identify historical threads, but rather to reposition the past in terms of the present diagnostic. Doing so, I hope to create possibilities for reevaluating certain things, those meanings and value that have largely become solidified and with dominant narratives, be they critical or orthodox in nature. So, this is a diagram that's drawn from the European Commission flagship project Destination Earth, interested in developing digital twin Earth, a digital twin of the Earth in purpose of modeling, monitoring and simulating climate and environmental effects. However, there's a more sinister sister of this Earth, envisioned by the new US NGA, or National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, called the Map of the World. The Map of the World initiative was firstly laid out in 2012 in NGA's 2000 to 2017 strategy, documenting its 5-year plan for where it wanted to go. At that time, it was fueled by the craze of big data tools and techniques, and with an abundance of data scavenged from an increasingly ubiquitous sensorium, the goal for the NGA was that the Map of the World would serve as the foundation for multi-intelligence integration, or as the geospatial bedrock for all knowledge, information, and intelligence. The Map of the World was thus to function both as a future cosmological imaginary of all the knowns and the discovery of unknowns, and, importantly, as an imperative for further investments, practices, and materializations. In the GeoInt community, this Map of the World was referred to as a living, multidimensional digital twin of the world that, according to the NGA, would provide no less, and I quote, a unified online geospatial, temporal, and relational view of the world. In 2018, Edward Abrahams and his GeoInt colleagues argued in a paper called Everything, Everywhere, All the Time, Now What? That the, and I quote again, the persistence and depth of data now readily available allows new products to be woven together out of these basic threads or classes of information. Vector-based knowledge, everything. Locational knowledge, everywhere. And temporal knowledge, all the time. This extends the analytical paradigm, they go on to argue, and I quote here again, to a knowledge environment in which every property of every entity is always available in real time. This is the vision. The authors then foresee an immediate future in which the whole Earth is blanketed and indexed like a spinning Google Earth globe with an infinite number of layers and an infinite level of detail. So what we see in this digital platform twin of the world is a world in which, and the story goes, the analysts can immerse themselves in data about everything and everyone in every location, all the time, and across time spans. This world is then not only imagined as a 3D blueprint for the world's terrain and buildings, the Map of the World is, in the words of 3 other GeoInt specialists, a living, global, multidimensional digital twin, a constantly replicated virtual version of the world, with an activity-based intelligence layer, tracking individuals and populations over time and cross-referencing their actions. Everything from the accumulation of 3D data on our bridges and houses and tracking our movements via GPS or Wi-Fi or health monitoring devices, the thermal assessment of our bodies in public spaces, the nature of our very genes, all are being aggregated into one database or another as individual puzzle pieces and trends. This is the vision again. By creating this unified ecosystem of what they call multimodal data, they create what they also call a multidimensional atlas of humanity. It thus serves as the ultimate historical archive and mechanism to record and assess our species and the landscapes we inhabit. So how should we understand and make sense of this imaginary and production of the digital twin Earth containing infinite data layered on top of each other and fused together for war? I think it's imperative that we look a little bit beyond the common frame of military perceptions and effects on the ground. Not that this is not important, of course. On the contrary, it is. The horrors of war is what is ultimately at stake here. But we need to expand our frames of what matters in war, not least because agency is now so messy and so distributed. So this means that we also need to consider the more dull world of computing and not only look at the tracking and whacking, here exemplified on your left, with a military patch from GeoCell, a heterotypic cell fusion between what is known in the US intelligence communities as phenomenologies, merging the eyes of the NGA and the ears of the NSA, or putting the warheads on the foreheads, as the US Air Force like to sincerely boast, or simply talking about death from above. For me, the important part here is to keep with the theme of this evening, to disarm the digital military twin, is to understand how it produces this world and what these understandings activate and operationalize. To do so, we need to focus more on what I call martial epistemology. I understand this as the knowledge produced for or by the military, making the argument how the armed forces and the larger martial apparatus are trying to, in various ways, to rationalize and standardize war and fix its essence. They are every day preoccupied with designing frameworks to make sense of the world and provide meaning for the sake of imposing order and predictability to the problem of war. There are, of course, many ways in which a marshal produces worlds, but here I'm going to talk a little bit about military targeting, how military targeting is a way to understand the world, a way to abstract the world, and importantly, to operationalize the world. As you can see from the diagram on the right, taken from the US Joint Targeting Doctrine, or more commonly referred to as JP 360, military targeting is portrayed as a continuous cycle, going from phase 1 to phase 6 and back to phase 1. But most importantly for what we're going to talk about today is based on a relational logic in which the world is made up of parts and wholes. As you can see from the quote and the diagram on your right, this is how they think about what the world is made up of. So military doctrine abstracts the world into spatiotemporal models consisting of battle spaces and processes, military units and assets, targets and effects. A particular concern for me when reading these military doctrines is not simply the enduring belief in the techno-rationalities or calculative predictions, but also the continuously and closely related quest to automate the battlefield, to make warfighting faster and more lethal. But let me return a little bit to the parts, the wholes, and the ties that bind, and talk a little bit about how they matter for war, how war is imagined, forces assembled, and what this means for how wars are conducted. Here you can see different images. On your top left hand is the consolidated targeting intelligence file that was used to compile what was known as the bombing encyclopedia of the world. This was a massive undertaking by the US intelligence agency and US military starting in 1946 to create an encyclopedia of targets, all over the world. What was contained in this bombing encyclopedia was largely files on infrastructures and fixed sites that they could then bring together to see how they would best fight a modern industrial state, especially the Soviet Union. To do so, they would put a lot of people in a room, give them information, and they would then fill out forms like this so that you would standardize the way targets were being made so that everyone was on the same page. This was then carried over to the war in Vietnam, where you see here on your bottom left individuals rather than fixed industrial sites. So here you would fill out a form that's very similar to the one above, but it's about individuals instead. These were individuals that were supposed to be hunted down and killed or captured. In this way, you would again standardize the parts to create wholes. On your right-hand side there, you have the targeted information folders, or what is known as baseball cards, that would fill in what Jutta talked about, the disposition matrix. These are all made in different ways, and I won't go into detail on how these were produced, but they're all part of a long history of trying to standardize, homogenize, and fix the production of data, the analysis of data, and the interpretation of data. And from these bits and pieces, the military creates a whole. They collate these bits, and through the whole, they determine the value of these. Up here, you can see a visualization of US Air Force Colonel John Warden. He was one of the chief architects of the bombing campaign during the 1991 Iraq War, and this is his famous 5-ring model. This is a system. This is how you think about a modern industrial state and how to destroy it. So up here, you would see that the most important part for him was the leadership. And then you have organic essentials, also called electrical power. And then infrastructures, population, and then military. This is adopted from something called the industrial web theory, created by the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1920s. So it's more or less identical to how you would think about war in the 30s, and then in 1991, and China in the future. The thing here is that you create a system, and you create a world that looks like a system, and then figure out from there how you destroy that very system you've created. So, for instance, in Iraq in 1991, they deemed electrical power as the most important thing, so they bombed all electricity. And when you bomb electricity in a country where it's fairly hot, it doesn't take long before air conditioning, refrigerators, and things stop working, in addition to all the people you kill on the way. So that is how you destroy a modern state. On your right, and which is connected to individuals, is the network. This is a specific technology without a logical end. You can keep adding to the kill list, as Jutta would say. But the kill list is only one part of it, because you will relationally link people to each other through the network. And additionally, you would put other things then, individuals into these networks. You would put things, moving things, infrastructures, everything. And you create a whole out of these parts. The important thing here is in this world of parts, wholes, and ties that bind, they want to sever the ties. And this is how you think about destroying networks or modern states. And what I want to argue here is that today, the way that the map of the world is envisioned, or the digital twin, is that it contains all this information. It contains all these individuals, infrastructures, and things that they have been looking at through targeting for a long time. So let me quickly just return to the digital twin dreams of the US Marshall apparatus. I mean, this virtual representation of a real-world system, a digital twin, they want to predict conditions, responses, and results. It's an entire information system that allows you to look at three main components. The what now? This is the representations of what is happening now. The what next is the forecasting of what will happen under normal conditions. And the what if, what happens if they change something of that conditions. But of course, the representation of the now is of course abstracted. It comes from military logic. It doesn't represent the world as is. It represents what they want to destroy. Todd Johansson, director of the Foundation GeoInt group, a unit within the NGA tasked with creating the so-called foundational digital twin, argued last year that the digital twin will automate and integrate foundational geospatial data, and I quote, to provide consumers with an immersive digital experience. A simulated environment where planners and warfighters see no gap in the transitions among planning, training, and operations in all domains. What they want to do is to use this digital twin to simulate warfighting, to simulate futures, to act on those simulated futures. And they want to do this in real time. That's the vision here. This ecosystem promises not only to transform what kinds of data will be ingested, processed, and stored, the where, how, and by what and whom, and what can be discovered of and analyzed about the world, but it declares itself as the horizon of all possible worlds and its future as it translates the world into data and data into worlds. It's colonizing the future and closing off other possibilities. Coupled with this closed world representation with near real-time simulations of best courses of action, and they are in the process of creating a truly experimental, violent world in which the boundaries between synthetic and simulated and the real are only further blurred. This was me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also, again and again, I love also that they make me totally nervous, but I love the diagrams. And thank you for all the insights. Again, we come back to that later. Because now I'm very happy to introduce Elke Schwarz. She's a professor at Queen Mary University of London, a professor in political theory, and she's the director of Theory Lab at the School of Politics and International Relations. Her research focuses on the intersection of ethics, war, and technology, especially in connection with autonomous or intelligent military technologies and their impacts on contemporary warfare. And again, I make a recommendation for reading a book, and this time it's Death Machines, the Ethics of Violent Technologies. Thank you for coming, Elke.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this panel. Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. So my work, as the title of my book suggests, in the past decade or so has focused on the ethics of military technologies, drones, autonomous weapon systems, military artificial intelligence, and so on. But as of recently, this question of ethics has become really thorny, and in order to better understand why the ethics in this particular domain is presently so fraught or under attack, I found it useful to try and understand the logics and structures of the wider constellation that makes up the material and practices of contemporary warfare. And so what I'll be talking about today is a slight shift, or rather I'll try and zoom out and I'll reflect a little bit, it's an ongoing preoccupation of mine. I want to think about the circulation of certain technological logics as a kind of a social and political ordering principle for our practices. In recent months, I don't know if you've noticed this as well, this idea or the notion of, or the institution of the Manhattan Project was conjured up very frequently as an example of how innovation and technology should be done. Last year it was the Oppenheimer moment. Oppenheimer was everywhere. This year is the Manhattan Project that is often used as a kind of an image, if you will. There was a US Congressional Commission recently of interested parties that suggested only a couple of weeks ago that what we really need is a Manhattan-style AI initiative. But really raising the specter of the Manhattan Project is, in those contexts where it is raised recently, not really done to bring forward a cautionary tale of, what could possibly go wrong if you engage in irresponsible acts and thinking about the long-term consequences of which we know now, but rather it is put forward as a project plan, as an unambiguous good which needs to be repeated for AI. It's a strange revisionism, but I take it as a prompt to look back into a time period in which this sharp drift towards autonomy came underway in its first instantiations in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. At that time, some, if not many, mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, theorists have already expressed many of the concerns that we have today, and perhaps they were able to still see the most thorny questions and problems that would arise when humans and machines come to merge in the form that today we take for granted. And I often like to go back to this gentleman here, one of the key figures in the history of cybernetics and artificial intelligence, and that is Norbert Wiener. He played a very important role in advancing automation and autonomy in weapon systems, but on the heels of the Manhattan Project and what came to be known about this entire project, the use of the nuclear bomb, he became increasingly wary about the role scientists and mathematicians have come to play in the production of technologies for warfare. And he was really ill at ease with this increasingly prevalent perspective which viewed technology and cybernetics not so much as an applied science, but rather as applied social and moral philosophy, as Stephen Himes notes in the introduction to Wiener's book. So technologics as a way to do things rather than purely technical things. In other words, Norbert Wiener saw then what seems perhaps less obvious to us now, that the logic of computation and information technology has become really a dominant mode of reasoning, philosophical reasoning, and it might come to shape how we think and, importantly, how we act in the world more broadly. For him, that was not a good development. He was not alone in this realization. The philosopher Hans Jonas makes a similar observation in the 60s in the context of cybernetic technologies. The philosopher of technology, Günther Anders, was, of course, another early thinker who had highlighted the very uneasy relationship of humans and machines resulting to challenges to moral responsibility and other kinds of forms of human agency as we take for granted. Hannah Arendt made a similar observation in her work on violence with respect to the scientific technological modalities, kind of as a stand-in for doing politics as a more relational kind of action or approach. Many others, from Lewis Mumford to Jacques Ellul. So there were many prominent voices raising early concerns, and I think it's perhaps worth revisiting some of these to bring some nuance into the current discourse. So today we are at a point, and we've heard a lot about it already during this conference, where the development and deployment of increasingly autonomous AI-enabled systems, including those systems that make or recommend targeting decisions, they're advancing nearly unimpeded and very quickly. We've seen many reports come out on the use of AI decision support systems with really grotesque names used in Gaza. Again, that was already mentioned earlier. But also the Russia-Ukraine conflict has tragically given quite an uplift to the perceived need to develop fully autonomous weapons type systems quite swiftly. And the conflict itself is producing extremely valuable data about conflict, with which AI weapons developers are hoping to refine and train their systems. So everybody's trying to kind of get their hands on the data that is produced in those conflicts, whether that's Ukraine or also Gaza. Any kind of active conflict is a useful data resource. So these contexts then become open laboratories for testing, trialing, iterating, and improving systems. Now, regardless of any discussions about the promises of accuracy and precision and sophistication, specific sophistication of AI-enabled weapon systems, the fact is that to date, we've heard all about this already, these systems, especially when they're intended to be used in a kind of open, complex battle context or zone of conflict, they're not likely to be very robust or reliable. And there certainly isn't any safeguard that they will be calibrated or indeed that they will be used in any way that restrains violence, that restricts violence. Quite the contrary, we're seeing evidence to that effect increasingly. But despite all this, the promises made about military artificial intelligence systems remain fantastical. Claims that AI will help win wars very swiftly, that war is just a software problem, just throw some code at it and we're going to be fine. That AI can make the globe transparent, that a digital twin can even be created. Those really fantastical claims are circulating quite prominently. They're a staple in this realm, and they fuel ultimately desires and projects that are then realized. So, for example, the US Joint All-Domain Command and Control Program is one of those projects that deals in omniscience and omnipresence made possible with artificial intelligence. Now, the JADC2, for short, this vision is one that strives for perfect connectivity, data connectivity that is, for real-time action at speed and scale across all domains. From the ocean floor to outer space, air, land, sea, space, cyber, all of it can be connected, and that will enable us to act really, really fast at speed and scale. The analogy that the US Department of Defense often uses to explain how this vision should work, how it should function, is the ride-sharing platform Uber. So instead of a ride, you coordinate rockets, anywhere, everywhere, at all times. But of course, weapons that employ artificial intelligence for the full kill chain are likely to be hampered by incomplete data, low quality data, incorrect data, discrepant data, irrelevant data, compromised data, all that. And this in turn will lead to highly brittle systems with biased and harmful outcomes. Conflict environments, this is rarely mentioned in these discussions, they're messy, they're dynamic, and importantly, they're adversarial. They're full of surprise and subterfuge. The enemy rarely will do exactly what you predict they will do. There's a ton of variability for which systems are not sufficiently trained, and they cannot be verified for this level of variability. AI data is very often mislabeled or labeled inadequately. And also research in machine learning for AI is by far not quite as scientifically robust as it might appear from media accounts and all the hype that we hear about large language models and ChatGPT and all the wonderful things these kinds of things can do. Now, this condition will inevitably lead to faulty decisions, to misapplication of force, and other harmful errors. Harmful, of course, mostly to those in the crosshairs of these eras, of these systems. So I would argue that where technologics dominate, harmful outcomes become simply folded into the technological practice, either as accidents or as part of the process, as an excess, if you will, of innovation as such. Now, the error proneness of AI systems and all that can possibly go wrong with those systems is perhaps not so surprising when we consider that AI as such is itself underpinned by what Matteo Pasquinelli calls a grammar of error. In other words, errors are always built in. They are to be expected. Limitations, approximations, fallacies, and vulnerabilities, as he says, are native to the AI paradigm. Machine learning then calculates the statistical distribution of a pattern, never an exact pattern, because it can't do that. It's always an approximation. Close enough will have to do. Pasquinelli calls it a technique of information compression, and he also calls it a statistical fiction produced in the interest of speed, optimization, and very often also in the interest of scale. So then machine learning as a technique is underwritten by a logic of waste, of excess, of failure, if you will, of doing, failing, trying again, getting closer, failing again, and so on, and using all the necessary resources to do so in the hopes of approaching some idea of perfection in a future-oriented kind of state. This logic of machines is worth paying attention to. I think they're not ever conceived in a vacuum or they're conceived per se. They are always social as well as technical. Of course, we know that. They're possibly, as Felix Guattari said, hyper-concentrated forms of certain aspects of subjectivity. Not the full range, but certain aspects of subjectivity. And we might want to look to the technology industry, or at least that's what I'm doing, to better understand our present condition, this focus in subjectivity, given especially that Silicon Valley and its financial backers in particular appear to be increasingly in the driving seat, at least in the US, but increasingly so also in European contexts, when it comes to dictating the rhythm and pace of military technological innovation, and also dictating the cultural shift towards full autonomy, towards removing the human increasingly from any kind of action loop, or certainly from the decision-making process, or at the very least marginalizing the human as human. There's a highly complex, firmly entwined relationship between Silicon Valley, ideas of military progress. Those two have always gone hand in hand to some degree, but also venture capital aims. Jack Poulsen, we've heard from him yesterday, his work is instrumental really in mapping and tracing these entanglements, and I'm very grateful for that work. I'm really focusing in a little bit more in my work at the moment on this venture capital logic. It embraces a similar valorization of risk, of error, and waste. We see investing as high risk, high reward investing. That means investors invest in a portfolio. Within that portfolio, only 1 or 2 companies will make it big. The rest will fail. So up to 80% of the investments might fail, but the home runs are so big that they will make up for the losses. But it is ultimately a bet. The dynamics of this relationship and the increasingly notable dominance of private sector rhetoric in the military sphere and in military operations also should, I think, give us pause for thought. The question we should ask is, what happens when the military picks up the pace of the technology industry, which itself is informed by the technology itself? The parameters of the technology industry are built on speed, scale, and always competition. Facebook, now Meta, of course, has built its business around the ethos that there's intrinsic value in getting products to market at speed, regardless of whether these technologies or technological ideas are fully fit for use. Everybody's aware of the iconic move fast and break things motto, which characterizes most of Silicon Valley. Another motto of the company that was in Facebook is now Meta. One of the slogans was, "Done is better than perfect." The impetus was speed, getting things done fast. This is the essence of the business practice, the hacker way. The technology sector must move fast. It's about winning the race to getting a product to market. It's about winning the race to getting a contract blitzscaling to creating a monopoly from which to extract monopoly rents, which ultimately means making extraordinary amounts of money from ultimately not giving consumers or customers a choice, creating a lock-in from which to earn money ultimately. So only by embracing the logic of error and mistakes can those involved move fast enough to gain an advantage over competitors. And this is precisely why the military AI industry cultivates a framing of competition, of an AI arms race. It needs that competitive framing as such. But it also is increasingly an attitude that is being fostered in and for the defense sector itself, advocated by those that need this framing. At a recent US Armed Services Committee hearing, Palantir's chief technology officer gave evidence to the committee, and he was advocating that we need, and this is a quote, more crazy. We need to let chaos reign, he said, in the military acquisitions and procurement process so that the necessary incentives can be fostered. Regulatory limitations, taking your time to think things through, all that is far too constrictive, he said. And he ends with, here's a quote, another quote, "I would gladly accept more failure if it meant that we had more catastrophic success." What kind of successes might be or what the implications are for failure for anybody involved, that remains, of course, unaddressed. But it is really clear that Palantir CTO here speaks with a venture capital logic in mind. So this notion of shortcuts and post hoc fixes are always justified with the understanding that mistakes can always be addressed later. They can be fixed through updates, upgrades, through reworking the system. So this mandate to embrace mistakes and error is valorized as such, and it is underpinned by the notion of speed. Speed trumps everything. The potential waste produced in this practice is always made up for by the promise of higher financial rewards with some specific success. Now, overpromising is a feature of this ethos, and it relies on the now firmly entrenched idea that at some point in the future, AI is going to be so good, so perfect, we are going to have so much data, not yet, but it will, that it will inevitably be a success. The success will be inevitable. This narrative of inevitability is found everywhere, if you will. Therefore, a future with AI is also inevitable for success. So do it fast, do it big, speed, scale. And this is precisely what underpins the problematic AI hype cycle in the military domain, but also otherwise. It is worth taking a closer look at those that make the technologies that are hyped the most and the loudest, if you will, not because they necessarily will be the technologies that will stand the test of time, but they will shape what is being paid attention to and how ideas of war and victory are framed. Needless to say, the military AI market is enormously lucrative. It's a promising market, currently valued at just over $9 billion US, and it's set to triple in the next 5 to 8 years. And aggressive newcomers are moving in very swiftly, backed by extraordinary amounts of venture capital, often from relatively limited number, a handful of powerful players in that arena associated with prominent VC companies like Andreessen Horowitz and Founders Fund. Startup unicorns are companies that are valued at $1 billion US or more, include Anduril, Palantir back in the day, Shield AI, and many others. They're all invested in the billions to become significant players in this market. And it's those types of players that, although they all profess to be deeply concerned about the legality and ethics of their products, in some arenas more than others, they're not necessarily displaying particular concerns about either. Palmer Luckey, he's the CEO of Anduril, he himself quips that even in an interview, he said, well, I might be sick in the head, but you need people like me who are sick in that way and who don't lose any sleep over making tools of violence. Alex Karp, CEO of Palantir, we've already heard about him. Meanwhile, in another interview, publicly declared he believes in inflicting pain, and he advocates for a US foreign policy approach that should focus on inflicting pain for generations on anyone that dares to harm an American. To be clear, technological innovations and military endeavors have always gone hand in hand, but traditionally it was the requirements of military organizations that would set the pace and the structure for technological innovations. And defense companies had previously worked in tandem with the military sector to foster innovation and ensure competitive advantage. And I'm not saying that that was unproblematic. There's huge problems with that too. But it is interesting to see what changes now because it has changed. Not surprising, because people with vested interests have worked on this for a very long time. The former CEO of Google, now defense advisor, we've already heard about him, Erik Schmidt, has really been a very vocal advocate of making military processes and procedures much faster, and he has forged very close ties with Washington to promote his Silicon Valley worldview. His Silicon Valley world, where advances in software and AI are the key to figuring out almost any issue. And others, including Peter Thiel of Palantir and Founders Fund, have worked very, very hard over the past decade to install software-friendly policies into governments through forging ties with government officials. There's a really interesting revolving door situation going on. For Schmidt and others like him, traditional processes and procurement processes in military operations are far too slow, and he appears determined to align the time frame of action between the military world and the technology world in a push to modernize the US military to make it more like Silicon Valley itself. Now, what Erik Schmidt and others in particular often fail to acknowledge is that they have various investments, venture capital investments and other investments in firms that need this defense overhaul for them to make a gain. The success of Schmidt's financial investments and Thiel's and all of investments of the other venture capital companies, the success of their investment in military AI hinges precisely on refashioning all social and political, and in this instance, military processes in the image of the technology sector itself. For the investment to bear fruit, those with vested interests need the government to operate at machine speed, not human speed in all aspects. VC interests don't have time to wait around for multi-year contract processes. They need a quick turnaround so that startups can get contracts, that they can raise more capital and grow in valuation. And the product really that VC companies offer, and this is a crucial point, what they offer to their clients, to those that invest in the funds, is not the technology, is not the company itself, it is simply growth and valuation, growth and capital gains over a specific period of time. So for this to work, the environment needs to be molded accordingly, and this is what we've been seeing. Where certain technologies become more pervasive, so does the logic of their inner workings. As AI and digital technologies are dissolved into our social, political, and military institutions, the structural and logical signature of the technology and its business becomes the substrate, an infrastructure which mediates and directs ideas along its functional lines. So I will close with what worries me about all of this. This is an irrelevant slide because I changed my mind how to close, but for your edification nonetheless. What worries me about this particular constellation, and that is Silicon Valley's active interest in infusing its DNA into the defense sector at large, is that the technological process it foregrounds is often paired with a very crude worldview of the worthy defending the free world, of the worthy defeating dark forces, of black and white, of good and evil, of constant battle, of urgency and existential fear. And this is then always contrasted by some equally crudely drawn utopia of victory and a glorious after of the battle. Not unlike the plot in the novels from which two of the more prominent companies draw their name, Anduril and Palantir, both are references to the Lord of the Rings. And these increasingly vocal and extremely well-networked and influential actors in that domain, offering these kinds of views, are not presenting themselves as mere businessmen. They are presenting themselves as saviors, as prophets, or at the very least as politicians who alone are able to restore the West, the world, the US civilization to some former glory and some future. These are very, very powerful narratives, and they offer, I think, a very terrifying outlook. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elke. I think it's getting denser and denser, and I wonder how we end up with the discussion. Anyhow, I'm very happy that we have another presentation, and I think it might speak also to what Elke said. I'm very happy that we have Marijn Hoijtink, and then again I need my... she's an associate professor in international relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Antwerp, and she's a principal investigator in a project called Platform Wars. Her research focuses on military technology, militarism, and the changing character of warfare, and she's particularly interested in studying military applications of AI, and I think the Platform War project will talk, as I said, to this venture capitalist logic and the changing logic of warfare as well. Welcome.
Indeed. Thanks, Jutta. And thanks, Tatjana, for bringing us together. It's really a pleasure to be in this panel with you, with people whose work I admire and build on. And as you will see in this presentation and on the slides, there's quite some similarities indeed. So I'm also grateful for the work that you've already done, so I don't have to explain this slide too much, although there's lots to unpack. So a lot of similarities, but I hope I'll be able to also contribute some new and different thoughts that I will mostly organize around the figure of the platform. As Jutta was already saying, just started a new project called Platform Wars, in which we're interested in sort of understanding this ambiguous idea, this ambiguous figure, ubiquitous as well, of the platform, which is representing a lot of the developments that we're talking about this weekend. So data-driven warfare, predictive analytics, surveillance, but also big tech in warfare and the hyped potential of artificial intelligence amongst others. So focusing, sort of zooming in on this idea, this notion of the platform, I'm both interested in the metaphorical work that the platform does in sort of mobilizing the idea of the sort of neutral metaphor, basically, of the platform as mobilizing data-driven warfare, but also as the platform as a concrete digital architecture that is fusing, analyzing, integrating data on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of locking in, also a term that Elke was already referring to, locking in the private sector into the public sector, creating new relationships of dependency between those who own platforms, the private platforms, the platform providers, and in this case, the military. Above all, I want to suggest also in this presentation, in my broader work, that those platforms embed, fixate ideas of perfect knowledge, of the ability to have a transparent battlefield, a term that we hear very often now, for instance, in the context of the war in Ukraine, the notion of precision strikes, the ability to link everything to everything else, something that JATC is seemingly visualizing. That also comes from Erik's presentation, the idea to reduce sensor to shooter times, and therefore also to systematize and to normalize, to naturalize the logic of targeting even further. So again, as Erik has already explained, we see sort of a much longer history of this logic of targeting being highly relevant, naturalized within the context of the military. My suggestion is that the rise of digital platforms as a metaphor and as a concrete architecture will do that even further. So this indeed, this visualization is the joint all-domain control and demand as it is proposed by the US Department of Defense. It's a vision on future warfare, and there's a lot to unpack in this visual, not in the least the sort of threat identification or a narrative that underpins it. But as Elke was already suggesting, what interests me here, what I find really interesting, is how JETC2 was sold to Congress, and how the DoD described JETC2 in or as a platform that could be compared to, in this case, Uber. So whereas in the case of Uber, the desired, in the case of Uber, different applications were being combined to create the most desired outcome between rider and driver. In the case of JETC2, the DoD describes it as a platform which would enable commanders to find the most optimal weapons platform, so a traditional military platform or weapon, to attack a given target. So this platform logic is very much intrinsic and very much relevant to this particular vision. So in the broader project and also in this talk, I would suggest that that's not a coincidence that we see this reference and this relationship to Uber or to any of the other bigger platforms, but that it is representative of a development which we could perhaps call the platformization of the military. So let's unpack this a little bit further. As we know from scholarship and in media studies, for instance, platforms very much shape or profoundly shape the ways in which we go about in our daily lives, our ways of communicating, our ways of doing business, our ways of learning, talking to each other, etc. This is also something that has been profoundly described by numerous scholars within media studies, including this book by José van Dijk, colleagues from the Netherlands, on the platform society. And as explained by many authors within this broader literature, platforms derive their power from specific technological practices and techno-economic models that are geared towards organizing user interactions, the collection of data and lots of data, their algorithmic processing, and their circulation, and eventually their monetization. Many of these authors also describe how platforms never come sort of alone, but how they operate as part of a larger ecosystem or network of other platforms, which are then owned by some of the most powerful companies operating globally, the platform corporations or simply platforms, right? So in warfare today, I would say that similarly we're seeing a push for even more datafication, surveillance, preemptive tracking, predictive analytics, where the platform operates as a foundation, as the solution, as the material manifestation of that data collection. And we see a lot of that ongoing and being sort of experimented with and perfected with, indeed, in the context of both Ukraine and Gaza. We're also seeing how the platform owners or the platform companies themselves become increasingly involved in the context of warfare. Of course, that is not new. Those relations go back to the Cold War at least, but we're definitely seeing increased potential in that relationship and increased investment also in that relationship. So these are numbers from my colleague, our colleague Roberto Gonzalez, for a recent study for Brown University's Cost of War project, and he himself builds on the work of Jack. So Jack, again, also from my side, thank you for your work, showing in this case tens or hundreds of billions of dollars going into some of these contracts that are operated with the larger tech corporations. And many of these contracts concern cloud or platform contracts, as we can see here. So we see Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Oracle, they're all in here, IBM. Let's see, Yes. So we have here the cloud platforms, the platforms as a service, basically contracts that Gonzalez traces. But we also have some of these new entrants that Elke was already talking about. Some of these new companies, former startups perhaps, such as Palantir, but also Anduril and others, which are very actively also marketing their platforms as a relevant model for defense and for the military. So here we see Palantir sponsoring a recent big event that was organized by the Special Competitive Studies project that Jack also talked about yesterday, the AI Expo for National Competitiveness, which very much sort of builds on this idea, capitalizes on this idea also of AI platforms for the military. And Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, has also expressed his ambition to platformicize everything, to platformicize public sector, not in the least the context of the military. So in this case, the platform is an important metaphor. I think yesterday Jana was talking about we need complexer metaphors to make sense of all of these developments. This is a very sort of straightforward, easy metaphor, of course, that resonates very clearly within the context of the military, where, of course, platforms and the concept of the platform has been around for a long time, referring to weapons platforms, right, or to big and complex systems. So it's a very resonating metaphor, I would say, but it's also a concrete digital architecture. Also another slide that should be familiar has been mentioned also by Lucy today in her talk. Here we see Palantir's AI platform for defense, which was indeed promoted in a very interesting 8-minute long video that was published a year and a half ago. It was promoted as a sort of chatbot style, indeed, military operator that would give suggestions on very critical military decisions, right, or actions about when to strike, where to strike, which weapon to use, etc. At the time when it was published, there was some discussion about, is this really working? Is this sort of a fictional platform? How should we make sense of this? And now a year later, some time later, we are hearing more and more about these large language models being used indeed in the context of the military with OpenAI, going military basically, and also most recently learning about Meta's Llama being reconfigured into defense Llama, as reported by The Intercept, which is doing similar work, right? Which is answering to questions, giving suggestions to questions related to military strategy, related to military decisions, with lots of questions and lots of problems, not in the least the question that these are, the issue that these are brittle, not robust systems, but also the fact that they increase or accelerate decision-making to the extent that it becomes very difficult to sort of intervene to control something which we can refer to as the automation bias in this context. Another example of such a concrete platform, so to say, or architecture that's being promoted and sold, in this case by the other startup that has also already been mentioned, Anduril, which is promoting its Lattice software platform as a platform that can enable faster decision-making and this is a quote from them, to accelerate the closing of complex kill chains. Their business model seems to be quite different, Anduril and Palantir, with Palantir really sort of, in this case, selling software as a service or platforms as a service, really trying to lock in the public sector into their platforms, whereas Anduril tries to do something different, tries to also build hardware and to integrate their software into the hardware, trying to disrupt or break up the traditional defense industry, right? The traditional primes that are building the big systems. So will that work? That breaking up. So still, we also spoke about it yesterday, that most of the defense investment is still going to the traditional primes, to their platforms. But this is, I think, also something that Elke is suggesting. The companies that we're discussing here are already having an important influence on military organization, on military culture, and to some extent also increasingly on military practice. So here you see a still from a platform that is used in the context of the war in Ukraine by the Ukrainian armed forces, that was developed by Ukrainian units, so-called do-it-yourself units, in collaboration with NATO forces and Palantir, as a sort of field expedient or inexpensive alternative for Jet C2, or at least it's been conceived as such, and also heralded as such. It's also apparently been used in the context of the Kherson counteroffensive, the counteroffenses. It's also been used in the downing of Moscow, as mentioned, it's been developed with the help of Palantir, amongst others. With again a quote from Alex Karp, who's now claiming to be responsible for the majority of the targeting that's being done in the context of Ukraine. Maybe to be taken with a grain of salt. At the same time, it tells us something about the importance of these types of companies and their platforms in very critical targeting decisions in contemporary warfare. So what to make of this? In earlier work, I've looked at, together with my colleague Anne Roos, Planquet van Hardeveld, we've looked at how this sort of creates fantasies of perfect knowledge, of a transparent and decentralized battlefield, of precision targeting, whereas of course we know that, the TV will shut off. That's going to be interesting. Whereas, of course, we know that that's not the reality, right? The reality of contemporary warfare. In other work, together with my colleagues Lauren Gold and Linda Adensen from the University of Utrecht, we've also looked into how these practices and these platforms contribute to compounding forms of violence, right? How they are part of these practices and logics of pervasive surveillance, which come over and beyond the death and the destruction that we're seeing in today's conflict situations and in today's context of war, where we also describe how the logic behind this platformization of the military is creating a sort of psychic imprisonment where people know they're being surveyed, they're under constant surveillance, but they don't know on the basis of what kind of information and when which behavioral or physical features will be acted upon. Most importantly, perhaps this, by the way, will also be this was also based partly on the work of Plus 972 and Local Call. So thank you also for your work, and I think we'll talk more about it and much more extensively in the next panels. Finally, something that I'm currently most interested in and working towards is to understand how these platforms create the lock-in effects that I've already discussed, how they render the military increasingly dependent on the infrastructure, but also the goodwill of platform corporations, and how this is also the business case, right, of those corporations to do exactly that. And how this means then that this development of platformizing everything is increasingly also blurring the lines of responsibility even further than we've already seen in contemporary warfare, and making it also harder to for us to understand who to hold responsible or accountable, but also for those who benefit from the system, who are part of the system, integral to the system, to feel responsible for the harm being done. Not sure if I should end with that, or with sort of coming back to the question of how to disrupt then this kill cloud or this kill platform as we could call it. And it's a question that also came back in our discussions in May in Paderborn, where I think none of us was very optimistic, but it's difficult to be more optimistic than then. We're probably more pessimistic even, because indeed of this of recent developments that we've seen, and increasing investments in these kinds of systems that we're interested in. But I was thinking that the sort of the blurred lines of responsibility that I'm talking about and that we see increasing might also increase our anchor points, right, for critique and to engage with those different actors and agents in the kill platform and in the kill cloud. So maybe we'll talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marijn. And as I said before, and now it got so dense and so rich, I think I only want to point out a few little things just to remember that it's kind of fair, because I mean that everybody remembers what might have been. And then I think we will open it immediately to the audience to give you a chance. And it's, as it always is the case with academics, I learned once in a while, if you only have like 20 minutes for your talk, you always get into trouble because either it's too long or too short, but it's really a difficult time to make. So that's the reason. So maybe just to remember or to point out a few things. Lucy, you were talking about data naturalization, the intensification of algorithmic intensification, and also about the shift from causality to correlation and the effects. And I think this fits very well to what Erik says, and I'm always like taking like, wow, this is unbelievable that people believe that they can simulate not only the whole world, but the future in real time. Imagine. So again, all these epistemological underpinnings. And also, the more and more I hear about, the more and more I do research myself, I think there is also a kind of a threat throwing under that, which is an enormous helplessness, because you get the feeling that they really have the feeling not to understand this world, that there's a feeling of a total over-complexity of the world, and it's kind of helplessly trying to figure out to understand it and to avoid the fog of war, for sure. And again, Elke was talking about the AI Manhattan Project moment in a way, which fits very well to that. But also you pointed out the underpinning venture capitalist logic. I think Marijn also kind of connected to that, but I also like to remind us that platform is also not only capitalist undertaking, but also a very strong metaphor, which also drives specific developments, and also the blurring of responsibility that comes with it. So, as I said, and what is maybe the most important that we have these developments, and they are, and that's why I said, so how do we end up this panel? But I think it's totally cynical to be so ignorant of civilian harm. I mean, it's hard to talk about that. And I leave it like that because I don't know how to disrupt, but I really very much desire that we will be able to disrupt these discourses and practices. And now I want to open the discussion, so please come ahead and ask for. I saw you over there.
Thank you. I had a question for Erik. So if one views a climate model as a global digital twin where data comes in and intervention comes out, how do you sort of differentiate maybe the sin or the problematization of these sort of models as reductionist, where the military is sort of on one end and climate science is on the other, or do you view climate science as kind of inherently militaristic in nature? Thank you.
Well, I think I'm not a climate skeptic, but there certainly are a lot of issues with climate data as well. So, but I think in terms of trying to kind of simulate climate and climate effects down the road is tricky as well. I think this is also a question of you know, a fantasy that we can actually simulate the future, and we can actually predict the future. I'm not, you know, you can certainly do so, but I mean the abstraction of the world in general is problematic for, of course, for simulating that abstracted future. And there's always something that is not in the abstraction, so something will happen. And I think the more complexity you add to this, the more difficult it is, and you know, this becomes a fantasy. But I think also, and I think this is also the EU project, the Destination Earth, is also a way to for the EU to get a lot of money into the to this kind of world. I mean, they want to compete on the AI stage as well, and this is a way to also do that. And I think that this is also very true in the US military as well. I mean, if you talk to people in the US military, they don't believe that JADC2 or the digital twin will ever work. But no one's going to tell you that because it earns you a lot of money and it gets you a lot of stuff that you actually want. So this is kind of the emperor's new clothes. No one's going to tell you that the emperor is actually naked. It works for a lot of people.
Well, it turns out I've got the microphone. So just a quick response to this last question. Some of you may know of the work of Paul Edwards' machine, The Vast Machine, which describes a century of incredibly detailed, very systematic work of scientists, climate scientists, to create a global a climate model where they compete actively and with each other, but also in a very collaborative way to create robust information about at least the physical happenings of the world. And I would say that while it was fed by a fantasy, has benefited from this enormous intellectual enterprise. And so we can have some reliance on what they come up with. Dealing with the social and economic issues of the climate is another matter. But that's very different than the world model that the digital twin that the US military is creating, because it appears to be a very self-interested model. So they're creating the world that they want to then have to deal with, or that they feel that they can, and the problems are hidden away. So what I think you've done on this panel very, very nicely is lay out in rather depressing detail the kill cloud, but the disarming part is much more difficult, and perhaps that's why you haven't been able to address it so well, or before you can get to disarming, you have to talk about. So I would invite you to talk about perhaps some of the fragilities and the emperor has no clothes aspects that provide points of weakness, of potential intervention, where people can point out that what is being portrayed here is an enormously expensive and lucrative fantasy that can collapse under its own weight, at least in part. Just as the dot-com boom of 20 plus years ago similarly went through that hype cycle, massive hype cycle, and collapsed. Now, of course, it didn't end up in a world that we might have dreamed, but at least it provided an opportunity to rethink how we could imagine that future and not accept these very powerful visions as inevitable, given even despite all the money and the commitments and the self-interest that so many people have. So it's an open-ended question.
Thanks, Andrew.
I think this is such a good point. I think it's really important. My hope is always that in not too long a time, it will all turn out to crumble because, you know, the systems are not reliable and ultimately goals will not be achieved. But of course, too many people will die in that process while that happens. I was at a workshop on AI systems and intelligence last week, and I think we all got stuck, or we all came to the conclusion that it is impossible to get reliable data for AI decision systems. That was and there were military people around the table, there were technicians around the table, there was me, there was other people, and we all ended up at this point that it will not be possible to get reliable data. And if that can be communicated effectively and pervasively and most broadly, then perhaps we can at least sow enough seeds for those that acquire these systems and that lock themselves in to stop before, you know, too much money is wasted or redirected into areas that can only foster violence rather than any other way to solve a conflict.
Yeah. Please. Is there a micro for a mic?
Hello. I just want to raise 2 points. First of all, going back to the error logic, sorry, and the precision that you have evoked throughout the panel. I think we should address the issue for what it is. I very much like what Thomas Drake said yesterday, that AI is the narrative. So we should ask ourselves what's underneath, right? And for me, the very honest answer is in Daniel Agary's quote in Lucy's slide, I believe, when he says that it's not a matter of precision and error, it's a matter of speed and damage. Because in the end, what lies underneath the killing of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, but also Afghani, Pakistani, etc., is dehumanization. I mean, these lives are not lives in the first place. So how do we address this issue, which is not an issue of the machine, the data sets, the biases, it's an issue with us. It's a colonial issue, it's a suprematist issue. I want to remind you that Golda Meir in 1969 said, and this is everywhere, in a very famous interview, there is no such thing as Palestinians. They do not exist in the first place. And there is a line connecting this quote from Golda Meir up to the very recent events in Israel when they say we are dealing with human animals and we are the children of light against the children of darkness. So this is a very human problem that does not concern the machine, because the machine is the narrative. We are the problem. So how do we address this? And going back to Jutta's question in the beginning of the panel, what does this say of our societies when Annabel Barbrock, the minister of this country, said that it's okay to kill civilians in the name of self-defense, you know, and this is on record. So how do we address this point? You know, because it is okay to kill lives that do not matter in the first place, as Judith Butler said a long time ago. So this is the first thing, which I really would love to have a conversation about this, because it's something that concerns us as human beings. And it's clear to me that there are human peers who do not think that these lives matter. So it's a failure of humanity in the first place, not a tech failure. And the second question is about, you know, no one has evoked the role of meta in the lavender thing. I guess might come up later in the panel. But so how does the IDF has access to the data? You know, because the targets are made using data that come allegedly, very likely, from WhatsApp groups. You know, so here I see this kind of hybridization, very, very dangerous, which shows that there is a blurred line between civilian context and warfare, in which I might be in the same WhatsApp group with, I don't know, Hamas suspect, just because my child goes at school with their child, you know. And so how do we address the role of companies such as Meta in this? You know, because in the end, the data come from something. They are not collected out of the blue, and they are collected through the platforms that we do use on a daily basis. And these people are not held accountable as far as I know. Thank you.
You know, thank you so much for that comment. And just in relation to the first part of your comment, I think you're absolutely right, and the narratives that we're following here are the extensions and elaborations of a much more long-standing justification of war as a mode of human action, right? And what we're seeing in modern warfighting is this increasing investment in the idea of that war can be made rational and controllable. And I think everything that we're seeing is an elaboration of that premise, and that premise is an attempt to provide some kind of justification for the fundamental dehumanization that enables killing of other humans. So we've got this an edifice that's being built up to assert that war can be governed, controlled, made precise, and that is a fallacious narrative, right? That is a big part of what we need to interrupt, and to bring things back to these much more basic questions of how we have come to inhabit a world where this kind of massive mechanized forms of killing can go on. And we don't have the international, the transnational institutions that have the power to actually intervene in that. And that's, you know, that is the basic problem I think that we're all talking about, right? So yeah, thank you for that.
Hello, thank you for your quite impressive and important presentation on work. And my question goes towards if you have looked into public research funding, in sort of funding certain topics that align with what you're researching on yourself. So my question comes from the déjà vu that I get when I hear certain words that I saw today, also the Destination Earth topic. So I usually write European scale proposals for environmental research, and I have the feeling it's the same words. And I wonder how publicly funded research also goes into the direction of, for example, platforms or the Digital Earth development. Thank you.
Can take this question, but I'm speaking now as a Dutch citizen, this is something that concerns me, and I think it's also an answer to the question that was raised regarding failures and contradictions in these narratives and in these developments, where at least in our context now we see sort of fundamental research being increasingly underfunded, whereas there is, of course, in the current geopolitical context, a lot of money, more money now going into military research and into the military. where I think we are increasingly again in a context where academic research is done in the service of the military, and where those questions are increasingly increasingly visible and increasingly relevant. And that also those interrelations also pose questions related to the failures and the fractions and the contradictions. Whereas maybe until a year or 2 years ago, I was actually, in a way, not really optimistic, but talking to people in the military and also in the Dutch military, I noticed that many of them were actually not so happy about these developments either, right? Or didn't find them very useful, were sort of skeptical of some of these visions and imaginaries that we've just laid out for you. But that space has also, to some extent, become increasingly limited with the funding coming in, with those new collaborations, also with companies and with academics. So that's maybe less of a space to engage with either. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate people coming and talking about these really depressing topics. And they're depressing. But I'm wondering if there was maybe some global pressure to kind of fix the UN, because I don't see any other organization that can tackle like just a smidgen of what's here. So I wonder if a call to action in that direction, if there's hope in that.
Apparently this sounds for me. So ever since I started studying politics, the UN was seen as broken, and there was a call to fix the UN. And I think what you're saying is really, really important, and it is crucial. And I think that the UN is an important platform necessary to come together. And I arrived at that conclusion because I thought the UN is broken, let's just disband it, or just be radical about it. But really, as an institution, it is the most important institution to have an international discussion. And in some ways, I'm not entirely sure what can be done to fix it. Obviously, the veto powers are a huge problem and an obstacle to finding consensus and pushing things forward. But other than that, I'm not entirely sure what can be done to fix things, and in some ways I sometimes wonder whether we don't need to be a little bit more patient with the UN and its processes, maybe, in order to allow it to do the work that it was initially designed to do. And so with that in mind, I completely agree with you, but I'm also always a little bit wary to kind of place too much of a burden onto the UN's shoulders and undermine its great work. Undermine the great work that is already and continuously being done under the broader and wider umbrella of the auspices of the United Nations and its various agencies. And especially in recent contexts, we have seen so much eroding or undermining of the utility, the important work of UN agencies. And I would not want to be part of that, but quite the contrary, want to reaffirm how important it is as an umbrella organization. That doesn't really answer your question, but...
Yeah, thank you very much for looking into the minds of Alex Karps and Eric Schmitz and the military and picturing that to us. It's very important, but it's no wonder that it ends up a little bit helpless or depressed when dealing with the visions of the bad guys in power right now. But we tend to miss out the material side, and maybe there's some hope of disarming if we keep that in mind. It's the same people who tell us the story that there will be war with China soon, and actually they saying this will be about the capacities to build chips, integrated circuits. That's another sad layer, that the war will be about the stuff that we get addicted to now. But it leads us to the material side. So short question, does anyone of you have an idea what would happen if we would stop extracting lithium from the earth for about 10 years? Maybe think about what data processing we really need to keep going. I think, yeah, that's in my mind.
Now I would like to answer, because when Elke said, I'm waiting that it's crumbling because people will realize with the data, and it will take some years, and again it's cynical because in between so many people will die. But recently we're doing some work on the FCAS, Future Combat Air System, one of the biggest, I mean Mari knows, but for the rest of the audience, well, it's a huge armament project, and it's cost about from 300 to 500 billion euros, maybe more. And then I was wondering myself, will it ever come into being just when you think of the resources you need to build? And that's now I'm following you up with the lithium. Because, for example, a jet fighter like the F-35, you need 450 kilos of rare earth metals to build it, such a system. It takes, I don't know the exact numbers, but 5,600 liters of kerosene for 1 hour of flying. And if you think that we are running into, this is maybe depressing as well, but if you think of climate change, I think sooner or later, either you have a cruel, can I say cruel, competition between socio-ecological transformation in the civil sector on the one side and this armaments or arms race on the other, or maybe we have to change our mind to survive. I think that's what I think, because there are not endlessly amounts of resources we can build on, and there will be a strong conflict. And now again, it's a half depressive, but on the other side, maybe it might help to change our minds.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think that connecting the dots between, these things are all really of a piece. So connecting the dots between colonial histories of a capitalist extractivism, environmentalism, labor, forced migration, that the coalitions that we need to form among those of us who are focusing on different aspects of this set of related problems, I think is the best hope. And I think there's more and more connecting up the dots of these arenas of urgent problem to see how related they are, so that they have to be addressed together, absolutely.
Yeah, hi. I'm trying to think of ways to, in this conversation, very dense, to just empower the average citizen to blow apart the myth that our technological progress is what what the narratives are. And I'm reminded of this video that sort of explained the technological environments to me very well at one point, which was this thing called The Secret History of Silicon Valley, about how the military-industrial complex trickled into the commercial sectors, and that was what really built the whole Silicon Valley and internet industries. And then it was really disturbing in this talk also to hear how the Ubers are drifting back into the military-industrial complex, and this thing is now a revolving door, which I guess it's been for a while. But just for the average citizen to kind of understand the myth of the technological progress, there's so many good arguments to blow that apart so that people don't use the Googles and the Ubers and these horrific companies and say, look, this is coming to an end. And we can see it in Gaza. We can see how it's coming to an end, used against civilians. And let's keep dismantling this myth. Let's have a neo-Luddite movement that is, from below, and we're all saying, fuck this shit. We're tired of the destruction of the planet. So, just so the average person can get that, and we all fight together against this mangling of our planet.
Right. What to say? I mean, making people aware of this unbelievable amount of surveillance of whole populations. And I think this is also an important point. How can we achieve to scandalize it radically that people are really getting furious? Because I think often people just don't recognize, and it's not that easy. I tell the story again and again. When I ask my students, and they said, okay, yes, we are all surveyed, and they know my name and my sex or whatever. And then we do a little experiment, because in Germany and in the EU as well, you have the right to ask any organization you have any contact with to give you your data. And it's a really rich experience for the students. For example, if they realize that Spotify calculates what kind of alcohol they might like to drink because of a specific kind of music they like. And that works. I mean, I can read with them endless papers talking about networks of control and surveillance. Well, nice. But if they just realize that the pharmacy next to them, they just collected all the data of all the medicines they bought in the last 10 years. And if you see these kind of things, and then you got a theoretical understanding how this all connects, it helps. But all the single thing, there's a camera or something like that, I think it's not working. And maybe we need to go on more in such a direction that people become really aware of what is going on here.
Can I just add to that? I do a similar experiment with my students too, and then they're always taken aback, and then it lasts about half a week, yeah, and then they go back to Spotify. Yeah. So what I wanted to say is, this monopoly status is really important to take into consideration, because you ultimately need alternatives for all the practices that we've developed over the last 2 decades or so, a decade. And so, these are infrastructures that we now depend on, and these are monopolized or largely monopolized infrastructures. And unless there are parallel developments or other alternatives that get us out of this lock-in, then it becomes really difficult. So this is a call to all the technologists there to, help us ultimately break the monopoly or disrupt the monopoly, or, give alternatives to these increasingly cemented infrastructures. It started with banking, then it was knowledge, now it's military, healthcare, all these really crucial things that we depend on. We need alternatives for that.
Okay, at least we tried a bit about the disarming, what's that? The online questions, I totally forgot about. I'm sorry. I guess I'm not, I apologize.
No worries. Let me scroll down. Okay. Question 1. They say online, the real problem here seems to be that powers that be the military-industrial complex, the politicians in charge, know about these concerns about automated weapons, but they just don't care because the war economy is a very useful market. How can we deal with this? Maybe we should imagine a more profitable market to attract them, the market of peace.
I like that.
Yeah, anyone who can figure out how to make peace profitable. But unfortunately, there's a bit of a contradiction there. But I think that's a real issue, because at this point, the profit to be made from diplomacy, negotiation, relationship building, cannot compete with the profits of the arms industry. So again, this is another piece of this puzzle that's absolutely crucial and really hard to deal with, but part of what we really need to work on, I think. And yeah.
Maybe adding, I have to to think of another crazy quote from Elke Schwarz saying at this AI National Security Conference, we are the real peace activists, right? So Elke was saying, quoting him saying, it needs to become crazier, but I wrote down even crazier in my notebook. But just to say that I wouldn't deny the possibility that these people think that they are making the world maybe not more peaceful, but at least more stable, which is the same in their book, right? So it's partly coming up with a new market, but it's also constantly, I think, pushing back and problematizing on those narratives.
So I think at least we tried a bit on the disarming, and maybe also, you're right, Andrew, but I would also say disarming is also deconstructing what's going on in this field, but at least we tried a bit, all more like in more concrete political terms. I want to thank you so much for being here, for joining your research with us, and I think if there are no more any really pressing questions. Okay, well, maybe one more, and then.
Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So I will try to be brief on this, but as a data engineer, we have seen how the growth of accumulating data and advancing with data analytics, businesses started to develop models around this, and then when it became I don't know, much larger in a way that we collect it, in a way that we process it, military and other fields are involving themselves as well. And what I want to ask is, when it grows up to the level of society, what is our perspective? If we were to make a company that collects all this data as well, a digital twin, what are the perspectives that we're going to ask it? This is one question, and my other question is, as an engineer, as an IT person, who have the knowledge, who has let's say the connections as well, what is my rule? What is my platform? Where can I fit in, not as an individual, for example? Okay, so thank you very much.
Erik wants
join us. No, but seriously, I think many of us are interested in developing these interdisciplinary collaborations also with data scientists, with computer scientists to collaborate, to learn to speak each other's language, so to say. And I think we've seen also some examples from, for instance, forensic architecture doing that kind of interdisciplinary work to bringing together data scientists, legal scholars, anthropologists, political scientists, etc., to sort of put a counter mirror to some of these practices and those in power. So that's one way, and I think, From my own perspective, I find that really productive to bring a group of people together. So we try to do this, for instance, in the context of a research program at Utrecht University called The Realities of Algorithmic Warfare, where we also collaborate with journalists and civil society actors to understand the realities, right, of impacts, but also of use and development. So in that sense, there is some links there.
Yeah, I can just add that I think it's important that computer scientists educate politicians on the limits of computer science. I'm not saying that, I mean, this is, of course, this is a long history. I mean, statistics is also problematic. So basic statistics is problematic because it's political. And social problems, it's very difficult to abstract social problems into digits, into things that can actually be computed. So, I mean, at least in our world, in the Western world, I mean, a lot of the social problems are always then thought of in statistical manner, in numbers. But once you start abstracting people's lives into numbers, you get into problems. You can't do it. Or you can't find solutions to it, because you made the problem into a problem of number rather than a social problem. So I think this is also where data scientists and computer scientists and statisticians can actually educate decision makers. So I think this is also a very good way to engage with the public as well. And you know, educate me as well. Thank you.
Yeah, great, thanks for that. And maybe I add a little bit. It was not about military, but there was a talk by Louise Neubauer. Maybe everybody in Germany knows her. She's a climate activist, and she was also like calling the data engineers and the like, think about in which company you're working. I like that as well. So just to add that. And now I want to conclude. Again, a big thank you to all of you for this session, which I really enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And this is not the end of this day, don't worry. I just wanted to say we will have a 20-minute break now. And then we will have an artistic talk by Shona Illingworth and Anthony Downey, and I'm very much looking forward. So, as Tatiana is always saying, don't run away. It will get maybe even more intense. So thank you for coming. And we have a 20 minutes break.